You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 325, recorded on Sunday, September 20th, 2020. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This week, we're going to be talking about the Boston police strike and police labor relations on the whole. For background, the Boston police strike began in September of 1919. Ran at its most maximal sort of definition. You could say it ran from September 9th, 1919 to December 21st, 1919. But effectively, as we'll talk about, it was over almost immediately. By September 12th, Samuel Gompers of the AFL had publicly urged the Boston police strikers to return to work. Instead, the next day, more than 1,000 officers were permanently fired. These officers were never brought back, even in the late 1930s when they tried, and fresh recruitment started September 13th. On December 21st, however, is when the new police force was fully staffed up and the Massachusetts State Guard stood down. And this is obviously important historically, not just for Massachusetts and the fact that it vaulted Governor Calvin Coolidge to the vice presidency the next year and then subsequently the presidency when Warren Harding died, but also police unionization was effectively ended for over 2 decades because of this. It sort of nationally, it was ended, even though this was not the only place where this was happening, as we'll talk about. And Boston's police did not unionize until 1965, when state law finally allowed it. So why are we talking about it this year, September of 2020, and not last year? Well, we didn't talk about it last year on the centennial because we were off the air. But as Rachel is about to talk about, this year seemed like a better opportunity to talk about it anyway because it's more topical in the sense that there's been a big debate again about the role of police in larger union organizations, such as the AFL-CIO and various other large unions representing large numbers of municipal workers like AFSCME and so forth. And this has been a hot debate all summer since the protests following George Floyd being killed. And Rachel, you're going to summarize for us sort of where the discussion is at on that and what kind of is the debate over that inclusion of police unions in broader unions.
Yeah, so starting in June, a lot of unions are kind of discussing the current role of police unions in the larger labor movement. So on June 8th, the Writers Guild of America East, which is a 6,000-member AFL-CIO affiliate that represents television writers and digital journalists, passed a resolution that urged the AFL-CIO to disaffiliate the International Union of Police Associations, which is the only police-only union in the Federation. In their statement, they said, as long as police unions continue to wield their collective bargaining power as a cudgel, preventing reforms and accountability, no one is safe. So the AFL-CIO kind of pushed back against the WGAE. There's not any intention from the leadership to push the police unions out of the AFL-CIO. However, this kind of brings up some of the bigger aspects of where police unions belong in the labor movement, or even if they belong there at all. But some of the problem is that a lot of police unions aren't affiliated with any national unions. So some of the big hotspots that have been in the news lately, Minneapolis, New York City, Louisville, Kentucky, Buffalo, New York. Their unions aren't part of the IUPA or any other AFL-CIO union. 3 are independent unions, and the one in Louisville belongs to the Fraternal Order of Police, which is a super conservative, reactionary police union. Also, the IUPA isn't the only union within the AFL-CIO that represents cops. They're in the United Food and Commercial Workers, AFSCME, the State, County, and Municipal Employees Union, the American Federation of Government Employees, and the Communication Workers of America, which are all major members of the Union Federation. So it would be very difficult to disentangle police officers from the union, and it wouldn't just be achieved by kicking out the IUPA. Also, I think union leaders are really concerned that because police membership is such a huge chunk of the union, that police would just leave the union and would kind of take away a lot of the union power from the AFL-CIO. So there's that fear that the police officers will just leave and really take away a lot of that leverage, that union leverage that comes with having such a large membership. Also, I think another discussion is that if we kind of abolish or try to reduce the power of the police unions that conservatives would kind of take that and run and kind of apply these restrictions to all public employee union activities. So I think there's a fear that it would be kind of the start of a slippery slope that would lead to public workers getting some of their rights taken away. And the AFSCME president, Lee Saunders, spoke to these concerns in an op-ed in USA Today, where he wrote, "Just as it was wrong when racists went out of their way to exclude Black people from unions, it is wrong to deny this freedom to police officers today." I don't really agree with that statement, but I think there's that concern that if you take away union power from one group of people, it would kind of apply to others. However, I think one of the big concerns with having police unions in the labor movement is that police are there to protect property, not really people. So I think a lot of rank and file membership in the union is really concerned that there's a lack of solidarity from the police. They're not there to raise class consciousness or class solidarity at all. One big example is in Wisconsin in 2011, where Scott Walker and the legislature were debating Act 10, which would revoke the collective bargaining rights for public employees. The governor, Scott Walker, carved cops out of Act 10, which deprived teachers and other public workers of the political protection that could come from a broader coalition. And the police unions chose not to stand with the other workers. So if police aren't really there to stand with the labor movement and stand with workers, do they really belong in the broader labor movement? Also, police unions have really used their collective bargaining to really give themselves immunity against anything. It's incredibly hard to fire bad actors that abuse their powers and act flagrantly against the law. It's next to impossible to get rid of them. And they have very generous collective bargaining agreements and very generous arbitration rules that often bring in sympathetic arbitrators that will side with the police against citizens even. So there's definitely separate layers of power that police have taken for themselves and haven't really extended to any other workers or any other unions. So with this lack of solidarity, I think there just really isn't a place for them within the broader labor movement.
Yeah, it seems like that the unions, if they say, oh, look how many members we have and we can't give up all these police members, it's like, well, what are you getting out of having them there? As I see it, the argument for ejecting the police, it boils down to three things. First of all, they frequently endorse anti-union candidates who support various right-to-work type provisions and things like that. You just mentioned, Rachel, about their support for Scott Walker and so forth. I don't remember if they had endorsed him or not, but either way, they got special carve-outs, and that tends to happen, right? They'll support anti-union candidates. Certainly President Trump, a lot of the police unions have endorsed. Then they get these carve-outs for themselves, and it hurts everyone else in the union movements, including the organizations that they're affiliated to. So it doesn't really help the broader union movement. Second, their role in strikes within the labor movement is very problematic. And we're going to get to this when we talk about the Boston police strike and some of the debates that were had around that. But essentially, if historically and to present day, one of the jobs of police is to maintain order during strikes, to allow strike breaker workers, scab workers to cross through picket lines safely, things like that, that is inherently in opposition to the objectives of the broader union organization that their union might be affiliated to. You can have a situation where they are actively working to weaken a strike by members of the same union. So that is a reason that you might want to consider not having them in the union. And the third one, which I think is the most significant, the most important, and the most obvious, is that yes, you can talk all you want about how, with some reason, right, that if you target police unions, at municipal level and so forth, then that's going to be cross-applied to various other unions. But there is a genuine distinction. It's not unreasonable to say there is a distinction between what a police union is and what the other public employee unions are, and to raise questions about whether or not police should even have a union, although we'll get back to the issue of working conditions and things like that. That's separate from some of the things like qualified immunity and arbitration that Rachel just mentioned. But just to put this in stark terms, as I've said several times on Twitter at this point, if there's a protest against the teachers union, right? Because there's that's the sort of the common target from people who don't like public employee unions, especially at the local level, right? And there are some people who like, oh, all these teachers are so terrible and you can't fire them, etc., which isn't really true. But let's say that someone assembled a protest to protest against how terrible they thought the teachers and the teachers union were. The teachers could potentially stage a counter demonstration or something like that, but that would be about the extent of their powers, right? The state isn't going to come in and like dismantle and disrupt this protest. And the teachers themselves don't have the authorization or the state powers and full force of the law behind them to tear gas the crowd that's protesting them, to beat the crowd that's protesting them, to arrest the crowd on various escalating and serious, felony charges and things like that. We've seen, for example, protesters in Colorado, I think it was, getting charged from protests earlier this year with attempted kidnapping of every single police officer in a police precinct that they had peacefully surrounded and sat down outside of, right? That was the extent of the protest. It was a sit-in, essentially, outside of the precinct, and they're being charged with that, right? That has to do with the specific prosecutor there and the fact that the protesters were upset about that prosecutor, so that's a separate abuse of power, but it goes to show you that there's a different set of rules and legal powers granted to protect the police unions. If people are upset about the police union and they go protest, the police union, in the form of its officers on the street, right? There's no dual loyalty issue about the union versus the state. Those have aligned interests, and they're able to defend themselves with extreme force and throw people in jail for criticizing them. That is not true of any of the other public employee unions or unions in general, and I think it is worth pointing that distinction out when discussing should they have unions or not. Should they be part of the union movement? So let's talk about the Boston police strike, because a lot of the debate that was held during that strike and immediately thereafter are some of the same debates that we're still having today, although in that case, many of the arguments were being raised, as the critics, point out, by the anti-union factions. But let's get into it. So the events of September 1919 in Boston took place in the context of the end of World War I in November 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles signing in June 1919, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, with fears of a similar uprising in the United States and particularly Massachusetts after the success of the IWW in the 1912 Lawrence Textile Mills Wildcat Strike, as well as the 65,000-strong Seattle General Strike of February 1919, the Cleveland May Day riots of 1919, and the spring 1919 anarchist bombings. Many of these we discussed in depth in previous episodes, and all of this is broadly part of the first Red Scare. Other additional pieces of context. The Massachusetts Volunteer Militia, formed in 1908, had been reorganized as a Massachusetts State Guard in 1917 for the purpose of repelling a German invasion if one came while the Army and National Guard were deployed in Europe, and this was still around when the strike occurred, and that was what was deployed to break the strike. The State Guard had also been involved in humanitarian efforts like the flu pandemic response and the Halifax explosion and so forth. Now, the strike breakers in the Massachusetts State Guard, as well as permanent replacements for the fired Boston police, were drawn heavily from veteran troops of the U.S. military in World War I, which the British then followed suit with in the start of 1920 in Ireland. Other strike breakers or militia forces included Harvard students, as it happened in the 1912 strike in Lawrence, which we talked about previously. However, many of the fired striking police officers were also recent veterans of World War I, while some older members were Spanish-American War veterans. So what led to the strike? Well, I'm not going to go into reading off all of the details of all of their grievances and how bad their pay was and everything. I've included it in the notes that'll go up in the PDF at arsenalfordemocracy.com. Suffice it to say, I'm not going to dispute that they had a case for going on strike. Like, the situation was pretty bad for them. Some of the working conditions were genuinely quite awful. And so you can see why they decided to unionize and why they decided to go on strike. But there had been a long breakdown in relations between the police officers and the Boston Police Commissioner, who was under the authority of the Massachusetts governor rather than the city of Boston or the mayor of Boston at the time. There were the grim working conditions, very low pay compared to other Boston workers, which, speaks to a solidarity component, right? If you can compare to your other fellow workers and see how they're getting paid, that does give you some leverage. There were lack of supplies being provided by the department. You had to pay for a lot of your own supplies. and there was a rapid post-war inflation that happened that was cutting into the real value of their compensation. More specifically, in August 1919, they had decided to affiliate formally, turned their social organization into a union, and affiliated it with the American Federation of Labor. The AFL had only just started that summer with unionizing municipal police forces, and they were doing that in 37 other cities that summer. And what was allowed by local order was that you could only be part of various internal departments, social clubs, or professional associations, not unions. And then some of the officers who were part of the union leadership were charged with unlawful unionization in September, and then there was a vote by the union to go on strike on the evening of September 9th, 1919. Only 2 officers voted no on going on strike, although several hundred, I guess, didn't vote apparently. But more than 1,000 officers did not show up for their evening shift. Now, again, as I said, this protest started on September 9th and was basically over by September 12th and collapsed. They lost completely. All got fired if they hadn't shown up for work at the beginning of the strike, and they were replaced, and they were never allowed to work as police again, I think anywhere in the state, apparently. So why did this completely fail? There's a number of reasons, but I think it's most important to stress one thing here, which, Rachel, I didn't know this, and I don't know if you knew this either, but apparently they undertook this strike without consulting anybody. So they had gone to the trouble of affiliating to the American Federation of Labor, and then Samuel Gompers wasn't even in the country when this decision was made. They just went ahead and locally voted to strike, and then expected all of the other unions to, stage some sort of a general strike in Boston in support of them. And basically, not only did they not get the support of almost any other union, there were a few other unions that did either some sort of solidarity thing or went on strike or wouldn't, work with the new strike breaker workers, that sort of thing. But basically, they went on strike. Nobody joined them locally. And then the national organization was like, what are you doing? There's no planning for this. You didn't do any of the preparation work. And this essentially killed all of the police unionization efforts everywhere in the country that they had been working on in, those 37 cities besides Boston. So kind of a huge disaster for the union movement on the whole, and also raised some questions about, again, what utility there was to bringing in the police into these unions if they weren't going to really, they were going to try to use the unions to their own advantage, but not actually work with them or listen to them or get advice from them or anything. So pretty much an immediate disaster, and the media coverage was quite bad as well. And this is important in terms of the national reputation of this strike. The local newspapers were all hostile to the decision to strike. One said, "Behind Boston in this skirmish with Bolshevism stands Massachusetts. Behind Massachusetts stands America." Another paper called the strikers agents of Lenin. A newspaper in Philadelphia echoed this, saying, "Bolshevism in the United States is no longer a specter. Boston in chaos reveals its sinister substance." The Wall Street Journal said, "Lenin and Trotsky are on their way." The New York Times also called it Boston's attempt at Bolshevism, which I think is bizarre because there was, as I just said, very little support from most other unions in Boston, and they were not willing to throw their weight behind the police on strike during emergency membership votes that they held on the matter. It wasn't just the local leadership of those unions. There were membership votes taken in secret, and the conclusion was, we don't want any part of this. Now, let's get into the debate over whether or not they should have been able to unionize or go on strike, and then we'll talk about what actually happened in this strike and whether or not there was the chaos being reported by these papers. So the New York Times said, and again, we've talked on previous episodes about how hostile to unions the New York Times was at the time. A policeman has no more right to belong to a union than a soldier or sailor. He must be ready to obey orders, the orders of his superiors, not those of any outside body. One of his duties is the maintenance of order in case of strike violence. In such case, if he is faithful to his union, he may have to be unfaithful to the public which pays to protect him. This situation is false and impossible. It is the privilege of Boston policemen to resign if they are not satisfied with the conditions of their employment, but it is intolerable that a city should be deserted by men who misunderstand their position and function as policemen and who take orders from outside. It is an imported revolutionary idea that may spread to various cities. There should be plain and stern law against it. It is practically an analog of military desertion. It ought to be punished suitably and repressed. a newspaper in Ohio, and remember this had just followed the Cleveland May Day riots. When a policeman strikes, he should be disbarred not only from resuming his office, but from citizenship as well. He has committed the unpardonable sin. He has forfeited all his rights. Local and national newspapers emphasized the first and second night of the strike's purported looting and chaos, although this was pretty much restricted to the most crime-ridden areas of Boston anyway, which probably would have just been like a normal night, even if police had been on duty, while everywhere else was basically uneventful. The second night's chaos, supposedly, was largely a response to the arrival of Massachusetts State Guard troops and their lack of knowledge or experience on either policing or crowd control, which led them to fatally shooting some people and injuring others while trying to contain the riots or stop criminal activity happening in plain view. A striking officer was also shot dead by a vigilante auto parts dealer after disarming 2 scabs. Despite all the hubbub about violent chaos, only 9 people died in total over the whole thing, and property damage only amounted to $35,000, which today would be a little bit over $500,000. And also, at the time, in 1919 dollars, private citizens raised nearly $500,000, which today would be worth $7.5 million, to donate to the guardsmen and to the small number of police officers who had declined to join the strike. So not exactly anybody hurting for money as a result of this purported chaos. I saw one headline said that there was terror reigning in Boston. This was not a local paper's coverage. The newspaper consensus was that the Massachusetts State Guard murdering several people was an appropriate action that disciplined the city's criminal element and subdued them for the remainder of several months of deployment. The national public's understanding was that Boston had instantaneously devolved into roving street gangs, women being assaulted openly, stores being pillaged, the Guard machine gunning the mob down mercilessly as terror reigns, and even in 1930, one of Boston newspapers was continuing to tout this narrative, despite how little of the city had been disturbed at all when the strike began. President Woodrow Wilson's public reaction, coming just a few weeks before his debilitating stroke, seemed based on these wildly exaggerated newspaper accounts. He labeled the strike, quote, a crime against civilization that left Boston, quote, at the mercy of an army of thugs. In reality, even the police commissioner contended after the fact that he probably did not need to call out the State Guard in the first place because the first night's disorders were actually quite contained. Governor Calvin Coolidge, as I said, was vaulted to the vice presidency in 1920 election on the line, there is no right to strike against the public safety anywhere, anytime, and he coasted to a landslide re-election in November 1919. Coolidge's other theme of the sovereignty of the state being under fire was also echoed in remarks by former U.S. Secretary of State and former New York Senator Elihu Root, who objected to the minority of unionized Americans seizing for themselves, quote, the power to enforce laws, the power to punish crime, the power to maintain order, end quote, by virtue of gaining control over the membership of municipal police who could strike at any time. Right-wing Massachusetts U.S. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge told a newspaper in Washington, D.C., quote, if the American Federation of Labor succeeds in getting hold of the police in Boston, it will go all over the country, and we shall be in measurable distance of Soviet government by labor unions, which seemed to be, to me, an allusion to the soldiers' councils that had led to the Russian and German revolutions of 1917 and 1918. Montana Senator Henry L. Myers proclaimed, quote, the nation will see a Soviet government set up within 2 years, end quote, which he did not mean as a positive outcome. As I said, I've included various other links and so forth that you can read at the PDF at arsenalfordemocracy.com about how basically quickly this strike collapsed and that they didn't get a lot of outside union support and so forth. But I think, and Rachel, you can let me know what you think, I think that this, as much as these sort of right-wing over-the-top reactions were to it and that they were wrong in guessing what the ultimate affiliation would be in terms of dual loyalty, it does seem like that this is a similar debate to what we're having now. Again, their prediction was that, you know, the police unions joining a larger union meant that the unions would have control over them and be able to call the shots during strikes or whatever, whenever there was a conflict between the state and the workers. In fact, it seems to have been that there is a dual loyalty problem, but it cuts against the unions rather than in favor of the police.
Yeah, I'm struck by Wilson's quote of Boston at the mercy of an army of thugs, because now what we've seen is that the police and the unions have so much power that they're not even answerable to anybody anymore. They're not answerable to city governments, it seems like, and the city governments seem to be almost fearful of the police and their union power. So it kind of has gone awry, but not really in the way that they think.
All right. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on this week to talk about the Boston police strike of 1919 and the current debate on whether or not police have a role in the broader labor movement and unions in general.
Thanks for having me.